This is the Almost Timely newsletter for the week of August 11th, 2024. Content authenticity statement: 90% of this newsletter's content was generated by me, the human. You will see some AI outputs in the opening section. And if you're watching or listening, I used 11 labs to synthesize the voice of a former Supreme Court justice who died in 1985. Learn why this kind of disclosure is a good idea and might be required for anyone doing business in any capacity with the EU in the very, very near future, like now. What's on my mind this week? How to use generative AI to understand good content. What constitutes good content? And how can generative AI help us make it? I've been thinking a lot about good content lately, about compelling content. What makes one thing worth paying attention to and not another? For example, you can't go for more than 2 thumb swipes on any social network without someone complaining that reach is in the toilet, that engagement is down, that people aren't paying attention. And yet, when you hit up the channels and accounts of the top tier content creators, or when you listen to system administrators like Adam Mosseri of Instagram, they'll say the same thing. There is no economic incentive for content channels like Instagram or LinkedIn or whatever to throttle popular content. It makes no business sense to show people less of what they love. Taking away great content from people would reduce ad exposure, and that's contrary to their very business model. That makes sense. So, why are people complaining about reduced reach? A good number of folks who are complaining are just not creating content people want. This is a familiar challenge for marketers. Most marketers know, if we're honest, we're creating stuff people don't love. We're creating, on a good day, mediocre content. Not good content, not great content, meh content. So how would we change this around? How do we build good content? First, we have to know what good content is. Quick, what is it? What are the common characteristics of good content? And how can we use generative AI to help? A lot of people crap on generative AI for making bland, boring, generic content, and there is validity to that criticism. Generative AI is very much like the mythical genie of fairy tales and legends. You get exactly what you ask of it. If you ask bland, boring questions like what makes good content, you get bland, boring answers. It's the nature of AI itself to return probabilities based on the questions we ask it. The more average the question, the more average the answer. But that doesn't answer the question of what good content is, does it? It just kind of shifts the blame. So how do you define good content? Well, here's how a couple of folks talk about it. My friend Ann Hanley.
Right, there are 3 keys to creating good quality, engaging content into 2016. And the 3 keys are bigger, braver, and bolder. Right? Bigger stories, braver marketing, or braver marketers as well, and bolder writing and bolder tone of voice. I do think, as Sydney mentioned, that the biggest missed opportunity in content is playing it too safe, right? I think very often we have tended to play it a little bit too safe when it comes to content marketing.
Or this quip from former Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart in 1964 in Jacob Ellis versus Ohio.
I shall not today attempt further to define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced within that shorthand description, and perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so, but I know it when I see it.
While that's Justice Stewart's definition of actually obscenity, it was a case about adult content. You could make the case that that's the definition of good content as well. I know it when I see it. Good content is content we like, content we enjoy, content we're compelled to consume, whether it's celebrities suffering, eating increasingly hot wings, or investigative journalism answering obscure questions like the hardest nightclub to get into in the world. And therein lies one of the greatest challenges of good content. It varies from person to person. Okay, so if good content is an individual choice, how are we supposed to create it at scale? Well, there are some fundamental truths to good content. One of those truths is good content is often a good story. Invariably, good content tells a story because we're adapted well to consume stories. Millennia before the printing press, we were sitting around campfires telling stories. What to eat, what not to eat, why Bob isn't around the campfire because he got mauled by a bear, right? We've learned through millennia to capture the information we need to share in a story, to convey knowledge in stories. Here's one of the challenges of storytelling. Besides the infinite number of ways there are to tell a story, our audience has specific kinds of stories that resonate with them best. If we want to be effective in our storytelling and our content creation efforts, we need to align our content with what our audience finds most compelling. How do you do that? This is an area where generative AI can't help you. It can't help you with it, but a real audience can. With your existing audience, ask them a simple question. What content do you enjoy? What shows do you watch? What podcasts do you listen to? What newsletters do you read? Especially like long form content. Ask them, what do you like? This is a critical question because the marketplace of ideas has already produced good content. The audience has already decided for themselves what is good and what isn't, especially for content people consume outside of work. We don't need to define what good content is, and in aggregate, we can't anyway, but we absolutely can get a sense from our audience of the content that they already appreciate. Once you have some answers from your audience, we can put generative AI to work in a way that we really can't as human beings. And here's why. Justice Stewart's definition, I know it when I see it, encapsulates a really important concept. Language itself is a form of code, a way to make very deep concepts, take them and shorten them, shrink them down to very compact terms. Think about how much data, how much knowledge and information is encoded in a word like apple or daughter or sushi or death, right? There's just saying those words, just hearing those words brings things to mind. Now, there's two challenges with language like this. First, the language is so compact that our brains have to fill in a lot of the blanks ourselves. If I say apple, what kind of apple? A Fuji apple? A Granny Smith? A Golden Delicious? The computer company? There's a lot of concepts packed into that one word. Second, almost every word we know is relative to our experiences. I love sushi. You may hate sushi. And there are so many kinds of sushi that my association of the word may bring up a very specific kind of sushi as a mental concept. And that is pretty much guaranteed to be different in someone else's head. I like squid and shiso leaf with a little bit of plum paste. I think that's an amazing piece of sushi. Most people I don't even know what that is. Right? So even though I use the word, it doesn't convey information cleanly. For example, I might have a certain mental and emotional association with even a simple word like mother. Some people have a very strong positive association with it. Other people have very strong negative associations. When we use that term, even in our content, we might be invoking wildly different associations in people's heads. Because of this, we have a very hard time putting into words why we like something, why we like a piece of content. We know it when we like it. We know when we don't like it. But we generally struggle to explain it in a complete and comprehensive way, partly because of how much language we need to encapsulate it, and partly because we have our own emotional associations that color our perceptions. That's what Justice Stewart was talking about 60 years ago in his ruling. We know it when we see it, not because we don't have the words to describe it, but because the sheer amount of words we need to surround the concept would be greater than an army of millions of ants surrounding a slice of watermelon just to define why we like something. Generative AI doesn't have this problem. Generative AI models have a nearly infinite vocabulary, trillions of words, and because they're not sentient, they're not self-aware, they're not emotionally intelligent, they don't have the loaded associations that you or I might have as individuals. That same averageness that causes them to generate bland content with poor prompts becomes an advantage when we need to find words to describe something, words that on average might resonate with someone. Let's put this to practical use. Suppose we learn from our audience they really love podcasts like Freakonomics or Search Engine. That alone is helpful information that could go in something like an ideal customer profile. But what if we could understand the meta structure of these shows to see how they're formatted and structured to be compelling? We absolutely can. Today's generative AI models like GPT-4 Omni, Claude, Sonnet 3.5, Google Gemini can all accept things like audio and video and all sorts of different content as inputs. So instead of trying to describe good content ourselves and stumble over the words, what if we could have a generative model consume some of our audience's favorite shows and help us understand the practices these specific shows use to create good content? In other words, we take the final dish and we reverse engineer it. We reverse engineer the recipe using generative AI. If we can understand the recipe, then we can take the recipe's concepts and apply it to our own content, converting it from good to better. So let's step through the basic process. First, using the Trust Insights pair framework, I prompt our model. Let me just close up the sides here so that we have a full screen and maybe make it a little bit bigger. There we go. All right. I prompt the model to spit out everything it thinks it knows about great storytelling. This step helps us diagnose whether the model even knows what it's talking about or not. It also helps to build an insanely rich prompt for future questions in this session, because every subsequent prompt in a conversation is composed of the entire conversation to that point. So as you're talking, the next thing you ask the model to do, the prompt for that is everything that has happened prior. So let's see what's in here. Best practices for great storytelling in descending order of importance. Understand your audience. Develop compelling characters. Craft a strong narrative structure. Show, don't tell. Find your unique voice. Common mistakes in storytelling: lack of clear stakes, weak character development, info dumping and exposition, ignoring pacing and structure, lack of editing and revision. Generally believed truths about storytelling that are actually false. Every story needs a happy ending. You need to plan everything in advance. Complex plots always better. Generally believed falsehoods about storytelling that are actually true. The first draft is always terrible. Yeah, not sometimes. Killing your darlings is necessary. Feedback is essential. Maybe. Expert tips, tricks, and secrets for great storytelling. The power of the rule of three. Things that come in threes are inherently more satisfying and memorable. Master the art of subtext. Utilize symbolism and metaphor. Create a compelling hook. Finding the universal in the specific. Ground your story in specific details. That's a pretty solid base of what good storytelling is, right? I don't think there's anything there that I would wildly disagree with about decent storytelling. So we have the solid knowledge base of what storytelling is. We don't need to do any adjustments on this one. Now we need, as Justice Stewart said, we need to help the model know good content when it sees it. So what we do is we take 3 or 4 episodes of podcasts. In this case, I'm going to take 2 episodes of Search Engine and 1 episode of Freakonomics. We're going to give it to the model. We're going to say, hey, model, if you know it when you see it, I'm going to give it to you here. You can see it. And these models can accept video and audio and stuff. You can see this first episode of Search Engine is 1 hour, 14 minutes. It turns out 143,000 tokens, which is about 110,000 words, right? How does this show? How do they do what they do? What are the strategies, tactics, and ways they implement their practices to make good content? I say, analyze this storytelling structure of this audio podcast. Diagram out what the story structure is and how well it aligns to your best practices. And so it goes through and says, hey, this episode of Search Engine utilizes multi-layered narrative structure that interweaves several storytelling techniques to create a compelling and thought-provoking experience. A framing narrative, the expert narrator, parallel character arcs, unveiling the layers, effective use of storytelling, lots of show don't tell, emotional resonance, juxtaposition, suspense, and mystery. Alignment with best practices, understanding the audience, compelling characters. Right? That's pretty good. That's a nice explanation of how this episode was so compelling. let's continue. Here is the next episode of Search Engine on the cockroach cure, which is actually from a different podcast. Again, same thing. Framing narrative, origin story, collective memory, building the case, the unanswered question, deeper themes, recommendations, all the different storytelling techniques, personal anecdotes and humor, historical context, expert interviews, sound design, alignment with best practices. And then, of course, the third episode, Freakonomics, 54 minutes, 80,000 words. This was on the opioid tragedy, framing narrative, shocking statistics, exploring known solutions, the puzzle, economic perspectives, the history of opioids, and so on and so forth. The storytelling techniques, expert interviews, statistical data, historical context, personal anecdotes, and the alignment of that. That's really good, right? That is 3 episodes from 2 different shows, and understanding the storytelling techniques that make them so compelling, so enjoyable. What could we learn from this? We could learn a whole bunch about things we could do to improve our content, to make it better. How do we do that? We ask the model to build a scoring rubric, a way for us to analyze our own content against the best practices that the model has observed. Remember, I know it when I see it. We've let the model see it. Now it knows it. We're going to have it now go from tell. So we've shown it. Now we want it to tell. So we're going to have it build a scoring rubric. That accomplishes 2 things. First, it helps the model be more granular about how it assesses and analyzes content. This is a prompting technique called chain of thought. Second, it helps us, the humans, better understand the criteria for the content we create. So it goes through, here's your storytelling rubric, 100 points. Narrative structure and pacing, 30 points. A good hook, narrative arc, unveiling information and suspense, resolution and conclusion, overall effectiveness, character and voice, character development, host, narrative persona, interview subjects, overall tone and voice, content and research, depth of research, use of evidence, clarity and explanation, originality and insight, sound and production, right? Some ways how do you make this thing sound? And then, here's what's good content. Below 60 points, no good. Above 90 points, that's great. Pretty handy, right? We have this great rubric. Now we can say, once we've got the informational infrastructure for understanding what compelling content is, storytelling in this specific format. And by the way, this is for this type of show. If your audience listens to a different kind of show and they love that kind of show, this wouldn't apply. Right? You would need to analyze whatever that show is. Maybe your audience really loves Hot Ones. How would you use the template of that show to understand the principles of storytelling for that genre? That's really important to understand. So we can say to the model, okay, give me a list of best practices. Now, based on all the content that we've fed you and the rubric. And it says, here's the best practices for creating, in this case, podcast storytelling. Start with an intriguing hook, build a clear narrative arc, pace strategically, transitions for the listener, characters and voices, and so on and so forth, right? This is a restatement now of all of our content creation best practices informed by the content that we know people love, the content that people are talking about. Depending on the level of control that you want to have over your final output, you could direct generative AI to say, like, hey, here's my content. Right? Score it. Tell me how I did. I did this with the first draft of this issue of the newsletter. I said, here is my content. Here's the article I was writing. I'll make this a little bigger here. And it said, okay, let's break this down and score it. And the first draft scored 57. 57. It said, hey, you did okay, but there's a lot of gaps. There's a lot of gaps. Like, okay, well, I guess I need to continue working on this piece. Now, granted, in fairness, this was the rough first draft. But I said, let's continue on. And I took its recommendations and I said, now, here it is. Here's the current draft, the one that I'm producing right now. Score this. and it said, okay, let's go through. And it said, here's your news scores. Here's the things you can do. 82 points. Like, all right, this is much, much better. Now, there's some stuff here that still isn't in here, like sound production. It's just not part of this because I wrote this before I had a chance to do the recording. But now I understand that if I want to create something that's more like the content my audience already loves, we asked this in the Analytics for Marketers Slack group this week. This is how I can apply the lessons from that content in a very practical way, in a very straightforward way to say, how do I do this with my stuff? And again, depending on the level of control you want to have over the final output, you could direct a generative AI tool to rewrite your content to adhere to these best practices, preserving your voice where possible, or simply produce a revised outline that you can then manually reorder your content with. Conceptually, imagine you wrote a country song and you knew what made a great rock song. You'd apply the principles of rock to your song, but it would still be your song. This is critical. If you want this technique to work well, but you don't want to lose your own voice, your originality, your unique style, you have to bring your own first draft to the party. Don't have AI build it. You build the country song and then have it make the rock song from it. And if you wanted to turn the dial all the way to 11, you could incorporate like your ideal customer profile in at this stage as well, and have the model critique not only your storytelling skills, but also how well aligned the content is to what your audience cares about from your ideal customer profile. That's how we build good content. So let's wrap up with this. There is no such thing as good content in aggregate, any more than there's such a thing as the average person. There is content your specific audience appreciates. Thus, there are no best practices for creating good content for the average audience member. But there are patterns we can learn from other content our audience already appreciates. We use generative AI to identify those patterns, distill them down into concepts we apply to our own content to better make it fit what our audience appreciates. But we do so with an eye towards maintaining our own voice and originality, just putting the content in a more appealing format. And when we do so, when we apply the structures and practices our audiences appreciate to our existing content, we'll make something they specifically like better. The road to good content has been paved by the marketplace of ideas as a whole. We just need the sense and the tools to see what's been done and travel down that road with our own content. And hey, shameless plug, if you like help doing this sort of content analysis work with AI, if you like what you saw, but you're like, I don't feel like doing that. That's what my company does. There's a link in the newsletter if you want to engage our services. So what else happened this week? I did a 5-part series. It was an interview with Stephanie Moore of Kent State University on generative AI in public relations. And so you can check that, the 5-part interview there. It's 45 minutes total. I just spread it out over 5 days. Also did a live stream this week on what to do with your ideal customer profile once you have one, which was a lot of fun. Let's see. Jobs this week. We have account strategist at Data Axle, associate director of digital analytics at DeBellis Catherine and Morale. That's a mouthful. Associate manager of paid search at New Engine. Content analyst at Generative, digital account manager at Ironmark, digital marketing director at Petwise, director of off-platform strategy at IBT Media, director of client strategy at Jefferson Wells, global head of SEO at Hyphen Partners, Google Ads specialist at IOI Solutions, Google Content Center AI expert at Cloud Destinations, Google Media Director at Gainer Staffing, head of growth at Storm2, optical operations analytics manager at iCare Partners, product marketer at Georgia Tech Systems, and tax content analyst at the Cydio Group. So lots of interesting positions happening this week. Upcoming events. The Marketing AI Conference in Cleveland is less than a month away. You can use discount code PEN100 if you want $100 off the ticket for that event. Lab Products Association in Philadelphia in September. Also, I'll be traveling for that, going down to the city of brotherly love. The Marketing Profs B2B Forum in Boston in November, Social Media Marketing World in San Diego in April. And there's a few other private events that unfortunately are under NDA and I can't talk about them, but if you're there, say hi. that is going to do it for this week's episode. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. I hope you found that it was helpful and useful, and that that you can use it to create some good content of your own, stuff that mirrors what your audience really likes. And use the lessons, use the techniques to do the same practice. And I think you'll find that you're able to generate great content, stuff that people actually love. That's going to do it for this week. I'll see you next time. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And if you want to know when new videos are available, hit the bell button to be notified as soon as new content is live.